Okay, 3 of the 4 terms are finished. But before we move on, Archimedes' experiment with the mass and volume of gold has led us to another very significant concept: density. Density is a measurement of the mass of an object divided by the space it takes up. This easy calculation is a way of identifying and separating substances. Silver and gold have different densities. That means in order to have the same mass, silver has to have a greater volume. The king's crown was probably silver and only plated gold, and that's why it took up more space than it should have. Every substance has its own density. Smaller densities rise to the top, while greater densities sink towards the bottom. Ice sinks in alcohol, but in vegetable oil, it floats. Notice that when the ice melts into liquid water, it sinks below the oil. Fluids order themselves according to their densities. Pure water has a density of 1 gram per milliliter, because 1 milliliter of water has a mass of 1 gram. It's the most common substance on the planet, and it's no coincidence that it has a simple, easy to remember density. The metric system was designed with water in mind. Densities greater than 1 will sink in water, while those densities that are less than 1 will float. Not all things sink at the same speed. We can estimate their densities by comparing how quickly they sink. The cubes on the right are more dense than the cubes on the left, but they are all greater than 1. How much of these objects are floating below the surface of the water? If we estimate the percent of the object under the water, it will tell us the object's density. This wood floats so half of it is below the water. That's 50%, so it should have a density of 0.5 grams per milliliter. Styrofoam floats much higher on the water than wood typically does. How much do you see below the surface of the water? What would the density be? 0.01 is much less than 1, so styrofoam floats. What would you expect from a piece of wood and a rock? Surprising? This exotic piece of ironwood is one of the few trees in the world that produce wood more dense than water. Pumice is an igneous rock, which means it's produced from volcanic activity. As the rock cooled, air was trapped in pores. As a result, the density is less than 1, and it floats. Keep that in mind if you're ever shipwrecked near a volcano.
My name's Jim Lovins. I'm the senior aquarist at the St. Louis Zoo, which means I take care of all the aquatic animals here. Pretty much like all animals. I'm kind of partial to our big catfish in here, Mambo. She's about, probably closing in on 100 pounds. Most fishes have what they call a swim bladder. It's actually an organ that's inside the gut area of the fish, and the fish basically has this inflated with gases. And it's the same gases you and I breathe. There's nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, but it kind of makes it like a balloon, because obviously, you know, there's some weight to the animal.
Air takes up a lot of space, while only adding a little mass. This makes the fish less dense.
Well, just like any other organ, it can have diseases or viruses, lots of things. Just like a human lung, it can fill with fluids. The animal would spend a lot of time on the bottom. It would work very, very hard to try and get itself to the surface, or even to swim to get food or escape something.
But not all fish use a swim bladder.
Only some of the most oily fishes in the world all come out of the sea. And as you know, oil is much lighter than water also. So it's able to make itself more buoyant because of the oils in its body.
It takes this guy a bit more effort to swim down to the bottom.
Good comparison. Yeah. Well, obviously turtles don't have that buoyancy control device. They do have lungs, so by getting a breath of air, they're going to be more buoyant. So they'll have more difficulty swimming to the bottom. Another thing they'll have with the swim bladder is maybe they've expelled air from their swim bladder, and that can happen from like a high impact. I mean, you don't think of fish as falling, but imagine a waterfall. It'd knock the breath out of you, right? Well, kind of the same with them.
If a fish loses air, it becomes more dense and has to hang out at the bottom for a while. A submarine is man's improvement on the swim bladder. Instead of filling up with air, a submarine has chambers that fill up with water. As the heavy water rushes in, the boat becomes denser than water and sinks. When the captain wishes to surface, the submarine can force the water back out into the ocean, making the sub light enough to rise. Density is a term we give to describe how much stuff is in a given amount of space. Higher density objects are found below low density objects. A hot air balloon must be less dense than the air in order to float. Water is denser than air, which is why we find the ocean below the atmosphere. A fish has a density very close to water, so it doesn't float or sink, but hovers where it wants to. And a chunk of concrete or steel has a density much greater than water, so it sinks to the bottom.